in the gilded halls of Aldermere Palace, where whispers carry more weight than gold, and every smile masks a secret, young Prince Alexander clings to his mother's hand as the most powerful woman in the kingdom approaches. What happens next will shake the very foundations of the royal family and expose a web of jealousy, manipulation, and forbidden alliances that threatens to tear the monarchy apart. Some bonds are sacred, some loyalties run deeper than blood, and some protectors will risk everything to shield the innocent from the shadows of the crown. The morning sun filtered through the ancient stained glass windows of Aldermere Palace, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floors where 7-year-old Prince Alexander played with his wooden knights. His mother, Princess Isabella, watched from her favorite velvet chair, her gentle smile brightening the vast library that had become their sanctuary. The peaceful scene would soon be shattered by the arrival of Queen Regent Vivienne, a woman whose hunger for control knew no bounds. Princess Isabella had married into the royal family 5 years ago, bringing with her a warmth and authenticity that the cold palace walls had never known. Her husband, Prince Marcus, was away on diplomatic missions more often than not, leaving Isabella to raise their son Alexander largely alone. The boy was the light of her life, with his father's strong jaw but his mother's kind eyes and infectious laughter that could brighten even the gloomiest corridor of the ancient palace. Queen Regent Vivienne had ruled the kingdom since her husband's death 3 years prior, wielding power with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She was a master manipulator, skilled at presenting herself as the grieving widow and devoted grandmother while orchestrating complex political schemes behind closed doors. Her relationship with Isabella had always been strained, built on a foundation of barely concealed jealousy and competing visions for the kingdom's future. The tension between the two women had been building for months. Vivienne believed that Alexander needed to be molded into a proper future king immediately, stripped of his childish nature and trained in the harsh realities of royal duty. Isabella, however, was determined to let her son enjoy his childhood for as long as possible, believing that empathy and genuine human connection would make him a better ruler than cold calculation ever could. On this particular morning, Alexander was excitedly telling his mother about a story he had read concerning brave knights who protected innocent villagers from cruel lords. His animated gestures and bright eyes filled Isabella with pride and hope for the kind of king he might become someday. She had been teaching him that true strength came from protecting those who could not protect themselves, lessons that directly contradicted everything Vivienne believed about royal power and authority. The library doors burst open without ceremony, and Queen Regent Vivienne swept in wearing her signature black silk dress and the family's most precious sapphire tiara. Her steel-gray eyes immediately focused on the scene before her with obvious displeasure. Behind her walked her personal secretary, Lord Hartwell, a thin man with nervous hands who documented every royal interaction for reasons known only to himself and the Queen Regent. "Alexander, come here immediately," Vivienne commanded in a voice that could freeze summer rain. "You have lessons with your new tutor and you're already 20 minutes late. This childish playtime ends now." Isabella felt her son's small hand tighten in hers as he instinctively moved closer to her protective embrace. She could feel his body tense with the familiar fear that always accompanied his grandmother's visits. The boy had learned to read the warning signs in Vivienne's tone and posture, knowledge no child should possess. "He's just finished his morning reading," Isabella replied calmly, though her grip on Alexander's hand grew stronger. "Perhaps his lessons could begin after lunch instead. He learns better when he's had time to process what he's read." Vivienne's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the kingdom's northern mountains. She had never appreciated Isabella's gentle approach to child-rearing, viewing it as weakness that would ultimately corrupt the future king. In her mind, royalty required sacrifice and discipline from the earliest possible age, and every moment of normal childhood was a moment stolen from Alexander's proper royal education. "The kingdom does not wait for a prince's convenience," Vivienne snapped, her voice echoing off the library's ancient walls. "Alexander will learn to put duty before comfort, responsibility before play. These are lessons you clearly cannot teach him." The insult hung in the air like incense, heavy and choking. Isabella felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she maintained her composure for Alexander's sake. She had learned that confronting Vivienne directly often resulted in even harsher treatment for her son, so she had become skilled at subtle resistance and protective maneuvering. Alexander looked up at his mother with confusion and growing anxiety. He could sense the adult tension swirling around him like a dangerous storm, but he didn't understand why his grandmother always seemed so angry or why his mother always looked so worried after these encounters. All he knew was that he felt safest when his mother was near, and the thought of leaving her side filled him with dread. "Please, grandmother," Alexander said in his small, clear voice. "May I stay with mother a little longer? I promise I'll be good in my lessons." Vivienne's eyes flashed with something that might have been satisfaction. She had been waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate her authority over both Isabella and Alexander, and the boy's innocent request provided the perfect opening. This was the moment she would establish once, and for all who truly controlled the future king's upbringing. "Your mother has coddled you long enough," she declared, stepping closer to where mother and son sat together. "A future king does not beg, does not cling to his mother's skirts, and does not negotiate with authority. You will come with me now, and you will learn what it truly means to be royal." Isabella felt Alexander's entire body begin to tremble against her side. She wrapped her arm more protectively around him, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the Queen Regent. The battle lines were being drawn in the ornate library, and innocent Alexander was caught directly in the middle of a war he had never chosen to fight. The approaching confrontation would test every ounce of Isabella's courage and determination, while revealing the true depths of Vivienne's ruthless ambition. Neither woman was prepared to back down, and their conflict would soon draw the attention of the one person in the palace whose loyalty could not be bought, threatened, or manipulated into submission. Captain Sir Edmund Blackthorne had served the royal family for 15 years, earning his position through unwavering dedication and an unshakable moral compass that set him apart from the typical palace courtiers. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders earned through years of military training, his dark hair showing the first hints of silver at the temples, and his green eyes missing nothing that happened within the palace walls. Unlike many who served the crown for personal gain, Edmund's loyalty was rooted in genuine respect for justice and protection of the innocent. From his position outside the library, Edmund could hear the rising tension in the Queen Regent's voice. He had been assigned to patrol this section of the palace precisely because Isabella and Alexander often spent their mornings here, and recent weeks had brought increasingly frequent confrontations between Isabella and Vivienne. His instincts, honed through years of protecting the royal family, told him that today's encounter was escalating beyond the usual verbal sparring. Inside the library, Queen Regent Vivienne stepped closer to where Isabella sat with Alexander, her presence looming over them like a gathering storm. The boy pressed himself more firmly against his mother's side, his young mind struggling to understand why his grandmother always made him feel so frightened and small. Isabella could feel her son's rapid heartbeat against her arm and fought to keep her own protective instincts under control. "Alexander belongs with me now," Vivienne declared, extending her hand toward the boy in a gesture that was clearly meant as a command rather than an invitation. "His education and proper royal behavior cannot wait any longer. Every day you keep him here, playing these ridiculous games and filling his head with foolish notions about kindness and compassion, you weaken him for the throne he must one day inherit." Isabella's arm tightened protectively around her son, a movement so instinctive and fierce that it surprised even her. She had spent years trying to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics with diplomacy and patience, but when it came to Alexander's well-being, her maternal instincts overrode all other considerations. She could feel him trembling against her, and the sight of his fear ignited a courage she didn't know she possessed. "He is still a child," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within her. "There will be time enough for harsh lessons when he's older. Right now, he needs love, security, and the chance to develop his natural compassion. These qualities will make him a better king than fear ever could." Vivienne's laugh was as cold as winter wind through the palace towers. She had little patience for what she saw as Isabella's naive idealism, viewing it as a dangerous weakness that threatened the very foundation of royal authority. In her experience, rulers who showed too much compassion were eventually destroyed by those clever enough to exploit their kindness. "Compassion is a luxury that kings cannot afford," she stated with absolute certainty. "Alexander must learn to make difficult decisions without being swayed by sentiment or emotion. He must understand that the crown demands sacrifice, often of the very things we hold most dear. These are lessons that begin now, not when he reaches some arbitrary age that you deem appropriate." Alexander looked back and forth between the two most important women in his life, his young mind trying to process concepts far too complex for his 7 years. He could see the pain in his mother's eyes and the cold determination in his grandmother's face, and somewhere deep in his heart, he understood that this moment would change everything, though he couldn't yet comprehend how or why. "I want to stay with Mother," he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a desperate plea. "Please, Grandmother, I promise I'll study hard later, but right now I just want to stay here." Vivienne's patience, already stretched thin by what she perceived as Isabella's defiance, finally snapped completely. She reached forward and grasped Alexander's free hand firmly, not roughly enough to hurt him, but with enough force to make her intentions absolutely clear. The boy gasped in surprise and fear, caught between his mother's protective embrace and his grandmother's insistent demand. "Enough of this nonsense," Vivienne declared, her voice rising with authority and anger. "Alexander, you will come with me immediately. Your mother has had her chance to prepare you properly for your royal duties, and she has failed. From now on, your education will be handled by people who understand what is required of a future king." Isabella felt her son being pulled away from her, and every maternal instinct she possessed roared to life with a force that surprised even her. She tightened her hold on Alexander, creating a tug-of-war with her own child as the prize. The boy began to cry, overwhelmed by the conflict swirling around him and the physical discomfort of being pulled in two directions by the people he loved most. "Let go of him," Isabella said, her voice carrying a warning that Vivienne chose to ignore. "He's frightened and confused. This is not how we should be handling this situation." But Vivienne was beyond reason now, driven by years of frustration with Isabella's methods and her own burning need to establish absolute control over Alexander's upbringing. She pulled harder on the boy's hand, her grip tightening as her anger increased. Alexander's cries grew louder, echoing off the library walls and carrying beyond the room to where Captain Blackthorne stood at his post. Edmund had heard enough. The sound of a child in distress was something he could never ignore, and his oath to protect the royal family extended especially to those who could not protect themselves. He pushed open the library doors with authority born of righteous anger and stepped into a scene that made his warrior's blood run cold. The sight that greeted him was one that would be burned into his memory forever. Queen Regent Vivienne and Princess Isabella engaged in what could only be described as a physical struggle over young Prince Alexander, who was crying and trying desperately to return to his mother's protective embrace. The boy's face was red with tears and fear, his small voice calling for his mother in a way that broke Edmund's heart and ignited his protective fury. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of 15 years of loyal service and unwavering moral conviction, "I must ask you to release the prince immediately." The intervention of Captain Blackthorne changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation, bringing a new element of unpredictability to what had been a private family dispute. His presence represented not just physical protection, but the weight of military honor and the possibility that Vivienne's actions might have consequences beyond her immediate control. Vivienne turned toward the captain with surprise and growing anger, her grip on Alexander's hand loosening slightly, but not releasing entirely. She had not expected anyone to dare challenge her authority, especially not one of her own guards. Edmund's intervention represented a direct threat to her carefully constructed image and her absolute control over palace affairs. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test loyalties, challenge authority, and ultimately determine the future of a small boy caught between competing visions of what a prince should become. The library fell into a tense silence broken only by Alexander's quiet sobs as Captain Edmund Blackthorne faced down Queen Regent Vivienne with the steady gaze of a man whose conscience outweighed his fear of consequences. His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the oath he had sworn to protect all members of the royal family, especially the most vulnerable among them. The air crackled with unspoken challenges and the weight of a moment that would define loyalties for years to come. Vivienne's eyes blazed with fury at Edmund's unprecedented intervention. In all her years of wielding power within the palace walls, no guard had ever dared to question her authority or interfere with her decisions regarding family matters. She viewed his presence not just as insubordination, but as a fundamental challenge to the carefully constructed hierarchy that kept her firmly in control of the kingdom's future. Captain Blackthorne, she said, her voice dripping with icy authority, you forget yourself. This is a private family matter that does not concern the palace guard. You will leave immediately and resume your duties elsewhere. Edmund remained motionless, his green eyes never leaving Vivienne's face as he processed the scene before him. Alexander's tear-streaked face and trembling form told him everything he needed to know about the appropriateness of what he had witnessed. Isabella's protective posture and obvious distress confirmed his instinct that immediate intervention was not just warranted, but morally required. "With respect, Your Majesty," Edmund replied, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "My duty is to protect all members of the royal family from harm, regardless of its source. I cannot ignore the distress of Prince Alexander, nor can I pretend that what I witnessed falls within the bounds of appropriate conduct toward a child." The captain's words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Isabella looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear, knowing that his intervention might save Alexander in this moment, but could cost Edmund dearly in the future. She had seen what happened to those who crossed Vivienne, and the thought of this brave man suffering for protecting her son filled her with both hope and dread. Alexander, meanwhile, had stopped crying and was staring at the tall captain with wide, wondering eyes. Even at 7 years old, he could sense that something momentous was happening, that this man was willing to stand between him and something frightening in a way that felt heroic and protective. For the first time since his grandmother had entered the library, he felt a small spark of safety kindle in his chest. Vivienne released Alexander's hand and drew herself up to her full height, calling upon every ounce of royal authority she possessed. She had not climbed to her position of power by backing down from challenges, and she would not allow a mere guard captain, regardless of his reputation or years of service, to undermine her authority in front of Isabella and Alexander. "You dare to lecture me about appropriate conduct?" she hissed, her voice rising with each word. "I am the queen regent of this kingdom, and Alexander is my grandson. His upbringing and education are my responsibility, and I will not have them compromised by misguided sentimentality or the interference of servants who fail to understand their proper place." Edmund took a step closer, positioning himself so that his body formed a protective barrier between Vivienne and the still frightened prince. His movement was subtle but deliberate, and everyone in the room understood its significance. He was making a choice that would echo through the palace corridors for months to come, choosing protection of an innocent child over deference to absolute authority. "Your Majesty's authority is absolute in matters of state," Edmund acknowledged, his tone respectful but firm. "But my oath extends to protecting Prince Alexander's well-being above all other considerations. What I witnessed here today caused the prince obvious distress and fear, and I cannot stand aside while any child, royal or otherwise, experiences such treatment." Isabella felt her heart swell with gratitude and admiration for the captain's courage. She had spent so many months feeling isolated and powerless against Vivienne's increasingly aggressive attempts to control Alexander's upbringing. To have someone finally stand up for her son, someone whose word carried weight and whose reputation was beyond question, felt like the answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. Alexander, emboldened by the captain's presence, ran to his mother and buried his face against her shoulder. Isabella wrapped her arms around him completely, finally able to offer him the comfort and security he needed without fear of Vivienne physically removing him from her embrace. The boy's relief was palpable, and his soft sigh of contentment only strengthened Edmund's resolve. Vivienne watched this reunion with growing rage and a dawning realization that her authority was being challenged in a way she had never anticipated. The captain's intervention had not only thwarted her immediate goals, but had also revealed the depth of opposition to her methods. She could see in Isabella's grateful expression and Alexander's obvious relief that they viewed Edmund as a protector and herself as a threat. "You have made a grave error in judgment, Captain," Vivienne said, her voice now carrying the cold promise of retribution. "Your interference in family matters goes far beyond your authority and will not go unpunished. When my son Prince Marcus returns from his diplomatic mission, he will hear a full account of your insubordination and inappropriate involvement in matters that do not concern you." Edmund nodded calmly, accepting the threat without flinching. He had known from the moment he entered the library that his actions would likely have serious consequences, but he had also known that he could not live with himself if he failed to protect a frightened child when he had the power to do so. His moral code demanded action regardless of personal cost. "I understand, Your Majesty," he replied with dignity and tact, "but I would make the same choice again without hesitation. My duty to protect Prince Alexander supersedes any concern for my own welfare or position." The captain's unwavering stance struck Alexander with profound admiration despite his young age. Here was a man willing to face punishment to keep him safe, someone who viewed protecting children as more important than protecting his own career. Isabella squeezed her son gently, hoping he would remember this moment and the example of true courage it represented. Vivienne realized that she had reached an impasse she could not resolve through force or authority alone. Edmund's intervention had transformed a private family dispute into a public challenge to her methods, and backing down now would signal weakness to everyone in the palace. But continuing to press forward risked further escalation and more witnesses to her failure to control the situation. The Queen Regent's next words would determine whether this confrontation ended in strategic retreat or explosive escalation, while Captain Blackthorne prepared himself for whatever consequences his moral stand might bring. Word of the dramatic confrontation in the library spread through Aldermere Palace like wildfire carried by autumn wind. Within hours, every servant, courtier, and noble knew that Captain Blackthorne had directly challenged Queen Regent Vivienne's authority to protect young Prince Alexander. The palace, usually a place where whispered gossip traveled slowly through formal channels, buzzed with unprecedented excitement and speculation about what this unprecedented event might mean for the future of the royal family. Lord Hartwell, Vivienne's nervous secretary who had witnessed the entire confrontation, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the primary source of information about an event that painted his employer in an unfavorable light. Despite his loyalty to the Queen Regent, he could not deny what he had seen: a frightened child being forcibly separated from his mother until a brave guard captain intervened to restore peace and safety. The story lost nothing in the telling, and with each repetition, Edmund's heroic stand grew more legendary, while Vivienne's actions appeared increasingly harsh and unreasonable. Princess Isabella spent the remainder of that day in her private chambers with Alexander, holding him close while he processed the morning's traumatic events. The boy asked countless questions about why his grandmother had been so angry, why the captain had helped them, and whether similar confrontations might happen again. Isabella found herself struggling to provide answers that were both honest and age-appropriate, knowing that Alexander was beginning to understand the complex dynamics that surrounded his position as future king. Captain Edmund returned to his regular duties with characteristic professionalism, but his fellow guards treated him with a new level of respect and admiration that had nothing to do with rank or position. They had all heard stories of his intervention, and many privately admitted they hoped they would show similar courage if faced with a comparable situation. Edmund's actions had reminded them all why they had chosen to serve the royal family in the first place, and his example inspired a renewed sense of purpose among the palace guard. Queen Regent Vivienne retreated to her private study, where she spent hours packing and planning her response to what she viewed as the most serious challenge to her authority since becoming regent. She understood that Edmund's intervention had transformed a private family dispute into a public referendum on her fitness to guide Alexander's upbringing, and she knew that her next moves would determine whether she could salvage her reputation and maintain control over the future king's education. As evening approached, Vivienne summoned her most trusted advisors to a secret meeting in her study. The group included Lord Chancellor Harrison, a calculating man who had served the royal family for decades and understood palace politics better than anyone; General Morrison, the head of the royal military who valued order and hierarchy above all else; and Lady Catherine Westworth, Vivienne's oldest friend and confidant, whose sharp mind and sharper tongue had helped navigate many previous crises. Captain Blackthorne's actions today represent a direct challenge to royal authority that cannot go unanswered, Vivienne began, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. If we allow a guard captain to interfere with family matters and question my decisions regarding Alexander's upbringing, we set a precedent that could undermine the very foundation of royal power. Lord Chancellor Harrison, a thin man with silver hair and calculating eyes, nodded gravely as he considered the implications. He had spent his entire career protecting the monarchy's interests, and he understood better than most how quickly public perception could shift against a ruler who appeared weak or indecisive. The captain's popularity among the guards and servants complicates matters, Harrison observed, his fingers steepled as he thought through the political ramifications. A direct punishment might create a martyr and generate sympathy for Princess Isabella's position. We need a more subtle approach that discredits him without making him appear heroic. General Morrison, a large man with a graying beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, disagreed with the Chancellor's cautious approach. He viewed Edmund's actions as military insubordination that demanded swift and decisive punishment to maintain proper discipline throughout the palace guard. The captain violated the chain of command and questioned royal authority in front of witnesses, Morrison stated bluntly. Anything less than immediate dismissal sends the message that insubordination will be tolerated. We cannot run a kingdom where guards second-guess their superiors based on personal feelings. Lady Catherine, elegantly dressed and sharp-eyed, offered a different perspective that combined elements of both approaches. She had observed palace politics for decades and understood the delicate balance between authority and popularity that kept rulers in power. The real problem isn't Captain Blackthorne, she said thoughtfully, her voice carrying the wisdom of long experience. The real problem is that Princess Isabella has been allowed to present herself as the loving, protective mother, while you appear as the harsh disciplinarian. Public opinion currently favors her approach to Alexander's upbringing, and punishing the captain will only strengthen that narrative. Vivienne listened to her advisors with growing frustration, understanding that they were describing a complex political situation that offered no simple solutions. She had always preferred direct action to subtle maneuvering, but the circumstances surrounding Edmund's intervention required a more sophisticated response than her usual approach. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Princess Isabella was meeting quietly with her own small circle of trusted allies. Lady Margaret Fairfax, her lady-in-waiting and closest friend, had arranged for a discreet gathering that included Father Benedict, the palace chaplain who had become Alexander's informal tutor in matters of conscience and morality, and surprisingly, Sir Robert Ashton, an older knight whose loyalty to the late king had made him somewhat critical of Vivienne's methods. Captain Blackthorne took an enormous risk to protect Alexander today, Isabella said, her voice filled with gratitude and concern. I fear that Vivienne will make him pay dearly for his intervention, and I cannot bear the thought of him suffering for defending my son. Father Benedict, a gentle man in his 50s whose wisdom and kindness had earned him respect throughout the palace, nodded gravely as he considered the moral implications of the day's events. He had watched Alexander grow from infancy and had seen firsthand how the boy thrived under his mother's gentle guidance versus how he wilted under his grandmother's harsh demands. The captain acted according to his conscience and his oath to protect the royal family, Father Benedict observed. History will judge him favorably for placing a child's welfare above political considerations. However, you're right to be concerned about the Queen Regent's response. She does not forgive those who challenge her authority. Sir Robert, whose graying hair and battle scars spoke of decades of loyal service, had remained silent during most of the conversation. But now, he leaned forward with the intensity of a man who had reached an important decision. There are more of us than you might think, he said quietly, his weathered hands clasped before him. Guards, servants, minor nobles who have watched the Queen Regent's methods with growing concern. Captain Blackthorne's actions today have given voice to doubts many of us have harbored privately. If she moves against him too harshly, she may discover that her support within the palace is less solid than she believes. The two groups, plotting in their separate chambers, represented the fundamental divide that was beginning to tear through the very heart of Aldermere Palace, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not just Alexander's future, but the very nature of royal power itself. 3 days after the library confrontation, Prince Marcus returned unexpectedly from his diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Valdris. His arrival sent shockwaves through both camps that had been forming within the palace walls, as everyone understood that his response to the crisis would likely determine the ultimate resolution of the conflict between his wife and his mother. Marcus was known for his sense of justice and his deep love for both Isabella and Alexander, but he was also bound by duty and respect for his mother's position as Queen Regent. Captain Edmund received the summons to Prince Marcus's private study with the calm acceptance of a man who had already made peace with the consequences of his actions. As he walked through the familiar corridors of Aldermere Palace, he reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment and found that he felt no regret for his choice to protect Prince Alexander. Whatever punishment awaited him, he knew he had acted according to his deepest principles and his sacred oath to defend the innocent. Prince Marcus stood by the tall windows of his study, gazing out at the palace gardens where his son often played under Isabella's watchful eye. He was a man caught between competing loyalties and conflicting versions of the same story, trying to understand how a simple family disagreement had escalated into a crisis that threatened to split his household permanently. His tall frame and thoughtful demeanor reflected the weight of decisions that would affect everyone he loved most. "Captain Blackthorne," Marcus said as Edmund entered and bowed respectfully, "I have heard conflicting accounts of what transpired in the library 3 days ago. Before I make any decisions about your future, I want to hear your version of events directly from you, without embellishment or justification, simply the truth of what you witnessed and why you chose to intervene." Edmund met the prince's gaze directly, drawing upon 15 years of loyal service and an unshakable commitment to honesty in all his dealings with the royal family. He understood that this moment would determine not only his own fate, but potentially influence how Prince Alexander would be raised going forward, and that knowledge gave weight and importance to every word he spoke. "Your Highness, I heard Prince Alexander crying in distress and entered the library to find him being physically pulled between Her Majesty the Queen Regent and Princess Isabella," Edmund reported with military precision. The child was clearly frightened and repeatedly asking to remain with his mother. "When I assessed the situation, I determined that Prince Alexander's immediate welfare required intervention, and I acted accordingly." Marcus absorbed these words carefully, noting both what Edmund said and what he diplomatically avoided saying about his mother's behavior. The prince had known Edmund for years and trusted his judgment implicitly, but he also understood the political implications of accepting the captain's account over his mother's version of events. "My mother believes you overstepped your authority and interfered inappropriately in family matters," Marcus continued, studying Edmund's face for any sign of defensiveness or regret. "She has demanded your dismissal and suggested that your actions represent a dangerous precedent that could undermine royal authority throughout the kingdom." Edmund nodded gravely, acknowledging the seriousness of the charges against him while maintaining his conviction that his actions had been both necessary and appropriate. He had spent 3 sleepless nights considering every aspect of his intervention, and each time he reached the same conclusion about the righteousness of his choice. "I understand Her Majesty's position, Your Highness," Edmund replied with quiet dignity, "but I cannot regret protecting Prince Alexander when he was in obvious distress. My oath requires me to defend all members of the royal family, particularly those who cannot defend themselves. If that conviction makes me unsuitable for continued service, I accept that consequence without complaint." Before Marcus could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Isabella entered the study carrying Alexander, who had insisted on coming to see his father despite the serious nature of the meeting. The boy's face lit up when he saw Captain Edmund, and he struggled in his mother's arms until she set him down so he could run to the captain who had protected him. "Captain Edmund," Alexander exclaimed, wrapping his small arms around the guard's legs in an enthusiastic embrace that spoke louder than any formal testimony about the child's feelings regarding the library incident. "Mother told me you might have to go away, but I don't want you to leave. You kept me safe when I was scared." Marcus watched his son's uninhibited affection for the captain with growing understanding of what had really transpired 3 days ago. Alexander was typically shy around palace guards and formal authority figures, but his obvious comfort and trust with Edmund spoke to a genuine bond forged through the captain's protective actions during a moment of crisis. Isabella approached more cautiously, her eyes reflecting both hope and fear as she waited to learn her husband's decision about Edmund's fate. She had spent the previous 3 days torn between gratitude for the captain's intervention and terror that her conflict with Vivienne would cost this good man his career and livelihood. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying all the love and concern she felt for both her family and the man who had risked everything to protect them. "I know this situation is difficult, but Captain Blackthorne acted purely out of concern for Alexander's well-being. He saw a frightened child and responded as any decent person should. Prince Marcus lifted his son into his arms, feeling the boy's complete trust and innocence as Alexander settled comfortably against his chest. Looking into those young eyes, Marcus saw not just his own child but the future of their kingdom, and he understood with sudden clarity that the captain's actions had protected something far more precious than royal protocol or political convenience. "Captain Blackthorne," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of both his military rank and his role as Alexander's father, "your service to this family has been exemplary for 15 years. Your actions 3 days ago, while technically outside your prescribed duties, demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and protective instinct I want surrounding my son as he grows toward his eventual role as king." Edmund felt relief wash over him like sunrise after the longest night, but he remained at attention as Prince Marcus continued speaking. Isabella's eyes filled with grateful tears, while Alexander clapped his small hands together in delight at what sounded like good news, even if he didn't fully understand all the adult complexities involved. "Effective immediately, you are promoted to the position of personal guard captain for Prince Alexander," Marcus announced, his decision made with the certainty of a man who had found the perfect solution to a complex problem. "Your duties will include not only his physical protection, but also serving as a positive male role model who can teach him about honor, courage, and the proper use of authority to protect rather than intimidate." The appointment represented more than just a promotion for Edmund. It was Prince Marcus's public declaration that protecting Alexander from all threats, including those that might come from within the royal family itself, was the highest priority in the palace. The decision would undoubtedly create new tensions with Queen Regent Vivienne, but Marcus had chosen his son's well-being over political convenience. As word of Prince Marcus's decision spread throughout Aldermere Palace, it became clear that a new era was beginning, one in which protecting the innocent and preserving childhood would take precedence over harsh traditions and political maneuvering. The young prince would grow up knowing that true strength came from those who chose to shield rather than intimidate, and Captain Edmund Blackthorne would stand as guardian not just of his safety, but of the values that would make him a king worthy of his people's love and respect. The shadows that had threatened to engulf the crown were finally beginning to lift, replaced by the warm light of courage, protection, and the unshakable bond between those who choose to stand together against the darkness.